parents to like drive us somewhere. We just hop on the subway, and we just go out, and we use the city as our playground.
You're gratifying me enormously because I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's a small city, but it's fairly, I wouldn't say rural, but bucolic in some sense. And raising a daughter in this city, I'm like, what is she like? She's surrounded just by like urban detritus, and like when she wants to go out and you know sit on a bridge and look at the water, and like what is she? I mean, you can actually do that right down here. Like New York does have, everything's harder in the city. Everything is harder, but I worry about raising a child here and what it's doing to her. But then I also think she's a remarkable creature. She's so much more advanced.
And how have you personally seen the city change over these past few decades? Immensely. I mean, in some ways that make me really sad and worried in some degree for the viability of this city. I mean, I've just seen the influx of huge money in, I feel like Manhattan has been lost to the enemy. I mean, Manhattan, there were no franchises in the city before. There weren't CVS's, there weren't Starbucks, New York was where you came to get away from all the rest of America, where you came to be Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan and whatever, it's like, and you took that on. There were all these sort of weird peripheral negatives about living in this city, which there still are. But it's the place that was similar to New Orleans in that you went there and you're like, this is not America. This is only New Orleans. Like this is the freak show that is New Orleans. And New York was very much that too. It's like, welcome to the East Village. You're in Mars now. I remember the whole thing crystallizes for me in that across from McSorley's Ale House there was this very cool, freaky woman who started a bakery where she just made chocolate chip cookies. She just made all different versions of chocolate chip cookies, and she had this entire brick and mortar shop that was just chocolate chip cookies, and she was amazing. And I was like, see that that's why I live in New York City, because there's the chocolate chip cookie lady, and you can go do that. And then she was forced out. And she actually down in New Orleans, where she actually properly should be. But my worry is that the kind of money that is forced, the kind of rapacious going on right now in development and it profits developers and it profits landlords, but kids can't come in here and just let's put on a show. Can't start a little restaurant, can't start a coffee shop, can't start bar or a chocolate chip cookie shop. A 23-year-old kid should come out and be like, I'm just going to go to New York because I want to learn everything there is about levain baking and studied tartine, and I did a stage in San Francisco, and I just want to start my own little bakery in New York. I don't care if it's super tiny. That's what I saw going on in the 80s when I was here, and it doesn't exist anymore. The sort of civic oversight is different between Manhattan and here. I had a little bar called Passerby, Lower Chelsea, what is now the meatpacking district. In fact, what was then the meatpacking district, but actually was a meatpacking district. It was just meat houses and tranny hookers, by night. It was a really seriously gaudy area. But that came sort of cheek by jowl with what are known as the big box clubs, these huge nightclubs in Upper Chelsea. And so there was a lot of constabulary scrutiny there. The cops were all over those clubs because those clubs were just dens of iniquity. They were, it was just drugs and sex galore, and the police were just like, that's it, we're these places. And so my bar was not terribly, actually not close to those. They were in Upper Chelsea and I was in Lower Chelsea, and it ran just a tiny little bar that was attached to an art gallery and was a completely different thing. But the cops are who they are. They're kind of blue collar, from Jersey and from outer borough, Queens and whatnot. And they'd walk in my bar and be like, who's this bunch of art? What is this? You could just see the disdain on their faces. And so it was, then we were just getting hammered by the police for just made up infractions. They'd come in and be like, premises disorderly, that's a $2,000 fine, this and that. They had made up this sort of quorum of laws that they were using against the big box clubs to sort of try to drive them under.
a lot of which I kind of understand. I think those clubs are super scummy and just profiteering, and I was just like, listen, I'm all for that. But my bar is a very different thing. And I'm getting caught up in this dragnet, and it's being really problematic.
Is there anybody who's walked into your bar that you'll never forget?
That I'll never forget? Yes, my wife. I met my wife at my bar. I mean, this is New York, so I had the city, or when I was tending bar at the Odeon when I first started here, it was just a celeb hole. It's like you just see. So it reminded me of like one guy came in like 3 or 4 years ago, and it was great. He was like, I want a drink that is a dancing bear wrestling with a naked clown. Make me that drink. Because I hear you're like, Mister, I can make any drink. And I was like, oh yeah, normally people start with a base spirit and tell me whether they want citrus or not. I mean, I have a sort of a whole structure of how to break down maybe what you want to drink, but say that again? He's like, yeah, a dancing bear wrestling with a naked clown. That's the drink I want. I was like, okay, gotcha, So I made her a drink. I'm like, here's your dancing bear wrestling with a naked clown. And he was like, dude, you nailed it. That's dead on. I'm like, yeah, of course I nailed it. Anything about New York City, and what I do in it? No, there's an interesting thing in that the cabaret laws. I don't know if you're aware of these. The cabaret laws are in the process of being rescinded right now for bars and clubs in New York City, and that's a very historical New York. It's a very interesting thing. You can do a little more digging on Google, but from what I understand, cabaret laws were the thing I used to get also hammered on in Chelsea. It's just a law that had been on the books since the very early 1900s. And it started when there were jazz clubs up in Harlem in the early 10s and 20s, starting to become interesting and alluring to like wealthy white Manhattanites. Interesting, and so the powers that be were like, there's too much miscegenation going on here, and hell no. Like, we're going to pass these laws where you can't have dancing in clubs unless you have this cabaret license. There's a way of trying to keep wealthy whites from going into black clubs and commingling there because they didn't want that going on, and so it just remained on the books, and from time the police would just utilize those laws. I mean, they're meaningless. It's like they literally were like, no dancing here. That's what my neon sign back there is. I'll turn it on for you if you want, but it's sort of a joke on that, where it was like, no dancing, you can't dance. People, blacks and whites can't dance together. It wasn't stated that boldly, but that's what those laws were about. And so they would come and hammer you for like not having a cabaret license. And you're like, what? What does that even? I mean, what is that? And so I went to go get a cabaret license. When they were 2,000 every week at passerby for people dancing, which people weren't necessarily dancing, as my bar was this big. But they'd say, like, I saw people kind of moving there. You don't have a cabaret license. It was just a sort of cover-all way for them to just gin up. I don't have a cabaret license. So I went to the city hall to try and get a cabaret license, and they were like, what's your occupancy? And I was like, my occupancy is like 38 people. Like, you can't get a cabaret license. You have to have an occupancy of over 250. I'm like, oh, so it's this total catch-22. I'm getting a $2,000 fine every weekend for not having a cabaret license, which I cannot by law obtain, given my occupancy. So you're just actually full of shit. I mean, this is just a civic ruse to get up money. A civic ruse to keep blacks and whites segregated. And now it's a civic ruse just to simply, get some financial puffery in the coffers. So just very recently, they have struck down the cabaret laws. That's a very interesting New York City historical thing having to do with bars and alcohol. And it's all tied into all kinds of different socio-political things that are relevant in